Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you would like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. On today's episode, Lianne McCray joins us to discuss being a doula. We also discuss neurodivergent empathy and secondary trauma. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Lianne, thanks so much for joining me here on Autism Stories.
Thank you, Doug. It's really good to meet you, and I'm excited to be here.
And I'd love to start out our conversation on where does your story in the autistic community begin?
Yeah, so I was reflecting on this recently because I only sort of self diagnosed within the last year or so, but I actually started wondering if I was autistic about 8 years ago because I made friends with an autistic person. We were just in a group, we met up together, and they were just super supportive of me and all my quirks and all my sensory needs. And I don't know if they suspected that I was autistic but didn't say anything, but just interacting with them made me wonder. But I was so freaked out. I have this fear of what I call space invading, which is like it's kind of like imposter syndrome but with identities. It's like I don't want to invade someone else's space. I shouldn't claim an identity that's not mine. But 8 years later, I'm like, oh, I am autistic. I wasn't space invading, I was exploring my identity. So that's how that happened. And having autistic friends is really what got me there. I developed close friendships with people who are autistic. And I like the term peer diagnosis. They say self diagnosis, but you can also call it peer diagnosis. A group of your peers gather together and they go, yeah, you seem neurodivergent.
Mm-hmm. And I like what you said about, self-diagnosis, but for like 8 years, you'd kind of been thinking about it. And, every once in a while online, someone will accuse us as autistics as, oh, everybody's now autistic, especially when we with self-diagnosis. And I don't think people realize that, like, we've been reflecting on these things for years just to get to that point.
Yeah, exactly. It kind of blew my mind when I did the math, and I thought that was 8 years ago that I started looking at books and looking at resources, but I was so anxious about it that I couldn't process it. And it took 8 years to get there. Yeah, it wasn't some like, oh, suddenly.
Now, you're the founder of It Takes Two, which provides birth doula services. And one of the things you do is to develop a birth plan and support each family in the decision making process. So, what are some of the important parts of the birth plan you work with families on to reduce their anxiety in this life changing process?
Yeah, that's a great question. What's great about a doula is you get more individual attention because obviously families have their doctors, their providers, but you see them in office visits, you may exchange messages, things like that, but it's really nice to have someone who cares about you who will really sit down with you and talk through these things. One thing doulas can do is help you interact with your doctors differently. I think we've all had the experience of, wow, that happened really fast and I had questions but I couldn't think of them, and or I didn't think I was allowed to ask. And so you get to talk it through with a doula and they can say, yeah, you can totally follow up with your doctor and say, wait, I didn't really understand this thing. And one thing I do with the birth plan is I just talk about possibilities during birth. So we can talk about what kind of pain management do you want to do? What do you want to do if this happens or if that happens? And, a birth plan isn't this is how my birth is going to go. It's these are my goals. This is what I'd like to experience. But it's also just an opportunity to think ahead about what could happen so that it's not the first you're hearing of it in the hospital while you're in labor. Like if something changes and you need to make a decision about an intervention, it's nice if you've already had that conversation before. I think that could be particularly helpful for autistic people or neurodivergent people who have trouble processing in the moment. If you've heard it before, you'll go, oh, that sounds familiar. And then you have your doula there with you to say, well, this is what you said you would prefer on your birth plan. Is that still true? Or do you want to make a different decision now? So part of it's just kind of the security of feeling a bit more prepared and aware of what your choices are and how you can advocate for yourself. And then part of it's also knowing that you don't have to do it alone. I'll be there to help you make some time to decide.
And on the It Takes Two website, one of the things I really appreciate about is you talking about how you're a queer, neurodivergent, and fat positive person, and know that resources aren't always affirmative or supportive. So, are there maybe any resources out there that you would recommend that are affirmative and supportive?
Yeah, this is such a great question. I think one of the hard things about finding resources is we all have multiple identities. So if I'm queer and neurodivergent and I'm in recovery from an eating disorder, it's going to be really hard to find someone who understands all of those things. That's why fat positivity is really important to me because it's very recovery oriented. So I have had to make do a lot in my life with this is a good enough resource, and I kind of cobble it together with this, and always striving to find that perfect thing that checks all the boxes. I did want to suggest a couple of things. There's this workbook called the Neurodivergent Friendly DBT Skills Workbook. DBT is dialectical behavioral therapy, and it's a skills based therapy which a lot of people find helpful. I've done a lot of therapy and I've done a lot of DBT, but I didn't know that there was a neurodivergent friendly version of the skills. And when I opened it and flipped through it, I had like autistic euphoria. I was like, oh my God, I didn't even know I needed this. Like they have like a mindfulness section of skills, and one of their mindfulness activities is spending time with your pets. And that's my favorite way to practice mindfulness because when I'm with my animals, I can just be in the present moment and enjoy spending time with them. I also found the Embracing Autism website really helpful. For autistic people, it can be dangerous to Google things about autism because there are hate groups and there are really highly medicalized resources out there on the internet, and you might find yourself stumbling into something that's the opposite of helpful. But there is a website called Embracing Autism, and they have a bunch of assessments on there that you can do yourself. And they also explain the assessments and like what's wrong with them because there's a lot wrong with them, but also why they still work. And I found that to be a pretty affirming place. And then on Instagram, is it okay to recommend an Instagram account?
Sure,
Is that
please
okay?
do.
Yeah, so I really want to recommend this account called RDs for Neurodiversity, and it's RDs underscore for underscore neurodiversity. This is a registered dietitian, that's what RD stands for, that is neurodiversity affirming. And that's the first account of its kind that I found that was like that, that really centers a neurodivergent experience for eating disorder recovery and finding healing with food. I also follow someone named ARFID dietitian, ARFID.dietitian. ARFID is avoidance restrictive food intake disorder, which is really common with neurodiverse people. And again, that's going to be some fat positive resources that are geared toward neurodivergent people. Because one thing I learned through my own trial and error is like there is a lot of help available, but if it's not specifically tailored to neurodiversity, it may not actually be that helpful.
You've been talking about eating disorders, and eating can be a very complex for a lot of us as autistic people. And I imagine that only magnifies during pregnancy. So I'm wondering if there are suggestions or principles that you have for those that are pregnant to navigate eating during this time period.
Yeah, I can imagine that that could be really difficult. Pregnancy can create a whole new host of just general sensory issues because of the way your body feels and the way your nervous system feels. And then we all know that pregnancy is well known to impact how you relate with food. It could be really triggering that you're hungry more often, because if you do have RFID or you have some complex relationship with food and you struggle to eat, having to eat more will actually be really upsetting. It won't just be like, oh, that's inconvenient. It'll actually be very upsetting. And then you may have aversions to things that you didn't before, or you may crave things that you don't usually want, and all of that's new information. So I imagine it can be really tough. And I think my advice often is like, try to tend to your nervous system as much as possible. And I think practicing self-compassion is really important. For me, an important first step has often been saying, this is really hard. Instead of being hard on yourself, what's wrong with me? Oh no, this is just really hard and I need some support. If you have coping tools that you already use that help you eat, try to lean into those. And you may need to get some support to find different coping tools because you may be having some different problems than you had before. Some things that I know work for a lot of people are trying to drink meals if eating and chewing is too much, trying to supplement with things that you can just drink. That's often saved me on really bad days. And I always encourage people to really embrace food that they enjoy and take away any judgment around what kind of food it is or what other people might think, because that is precious material. If it's a food that you actually enjoy and you want to eat, let yourself eat it, because the most important thing is that you are fed. And that's really my only rule. I just gave a workshop called Nourishing While Neurodivergent, and I said, my only food rule is eat. That's it.
Mm-hmm. You also talk on your website how you're deeply spiritual and fairly unorthodox, which I think can describe many of us as autistic people. So that makes me wonder if you think there are any ways in which your neurodivergence helps you to be a better doula.
I think so. It's interesting, not having known that I'm neurodivergent for such a long time. But even before I did, I've kind of always had this experience of being a person who can sort of fit into a lot of places, and sometimes places that seem contradictory, but doesn't totally fit in anywhere. And I think of like when there's like a tile floor or a tile wall, the grout between them, I see myself as grout. Like I kind of am good at like filling in the gaps, and I think it's because I had to be, because I didn't easily find places that were like 100% compatible with me and who I was, but I found a way to connect to everywhere that I was so I could get by and find joy and stuff like that. And so I'm kind of used to pulling together different ideas that other people might find strange or contradictory. And it makes me very accepting of other people too in their own journey, because I think the truth is most of us don't fit into the boxes that are presented to us. I just feel like me and my various identities, I felt the pain of trying to squeeze into boxes more and sooner than other people might. Sometimes I think like, I don't think our culture is particularly good for anyone, but I think that people like me who are neurodivergent, who are queer, who have mental illness, like we feel the flaws of our system more acutely and sooner than other people do, which is actually a gift. It's a gift to be able to say, this isn't really right. How can we make this better? And that's what I do with my clients. My goal as a doula is to make the world more accommodating, because I don't think the world is accommodating enough. And I've had tons of experiences with what it's like to not be accommodated. And so if I can make anyone's experience on earth a little softer and more friendly, that's what I want to do.
And Lianne, how can our listeners learn more about you and It Takes Two doula services beyond this interview?
That's a great question. I forgot to write down my stuff. My Instagram handle is doula Lianne, which is DoulaLianne. I do have a website. It's most easily accessible via the bit.ly link, which is bit.ly/I, T, DOULA, which is ITT doula. It Takes Two doula. Those are probably the best ways to get a hold of me and see more about what I'm doing.
And lastly, you had mentioned Instagram. I wanted to talk to you about something that you had posted on Instagram recently regarding neurodivergent empathy and secondary trauma. What's your definition of secondary trauma, and what are some ways you found to help with it, whether it's dealing with watching the news or being on social media?
Yeah, so this is something I have an autism therapist, and she helped me a lot with this recently, which is why I was inspired to make that post. Secondary trauma is just trauma that you experience by witnessing or hearing about traumatic events that are happening to other people. Even if your distress is not to the degree that you would call it trauma, I think it's still valid. Neurodivergent people have various qualities that make us more prone to feeling highly distressed and dysregulated when we just hear about or witness traumatic things that are happening in the world. And that's kind of the interesting thing about the world we live in today is we have access to so much news and so many news stories and what's going on, and it's constant access to, and things are always developing, and in a lot of ways that's good, but I think some of us really need and deserve to titrate how much of that we absorb because the distress is really real. If you find yourself becoming really dysregulated and triggered and just really not okay because you're reading a news source, that's really valid. I know for me, a lot of what drives me trying to keep up with the news is I want to be a good person and I want to be engaged and involved. And I have these values of justice and compassion that I really care about. And so I feel pressure to constantly absorb news. And my mantra that has helped me with this is that my suffering is not community service. I'm not making the world better by harming myself or being harmed. And I also try to reframe it as like the reason it hurts me is that I care. It's because I care. This isn't an issue of me being a good person. What's at issue here is that I'm highly sensitive. I have hyper empathy. I have hyperphantasia, which is when your visual imagination or memory is extremely vivid. That's one thing that can make reading the news upsetting, is that you hear about something and you can picture it and it's awful. And then a lot of neurodivergent people have justice sensitivity too, which is just having a really strong reaction to witnessing injustice. And that's very admirable. But that doesn't mean that you have to suffer because you care. So, yeah, I think the mantra, my suffering is not community service, is really helpful. The best thing we can do for the world is take really good care of ourselves so we can be present in the ways that matter with people we love and with communities we care about.
I can't watch the news. I could watch it for 5 minutes here and there, but yes, like if I did, I think it just wouldn't do me any good. I'm okay with not knowing as much as other people, and I think feeling more confident that I'm helping people out in other ways, and eventually I'll learn, what's going on in the world and try to educate myself. But I don't know
Yeah.
how people watch the news every day and like can function.
Yeah, I think being an involved citizen should be accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have something to offer, you should be able to offer it in a way that is accessible and not harmful to you. I think it's completely valid to not be able to watch the news. And sometimes I think about early humans and how when the sun went down, it was dark, and we looked at the stars and we went to sleep, and then we woke up when the sun came up. Like, we didn't have phones telling us what, all the awful things that were happening, not just in our community, but in communities around the world. It's a lot of information, and our brains aren't really designed to be able to process that much suffering. I have often found thinking about the world suffering really overwhelming because there's so much of it. And so sometimes I do need to make my life a little smaller and focus on what's right in front of me, because when I'm well, then I can show up and actually be of help. It's not actually helpful to anyone if I'm so upset I can't function and I can't exist in the world. And I think the other thing is we're humans too, and we also deserve peace and freedom. Everyone does. That's why the news is so upsetting, because so many people aren't getting what they need. We also have needs, and that's okay.
And I'm not here to tell anyone to not watch the news, but just hearing what you say, and I've heard that opinion from others, is it allows you to show up and be a doula and help other people to get through some of the most important times of their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's options. You don't have to watch the news. You can choose how you receive your news. You can choose,
Mm-hmm.
I will only look at this one app and I'll only look at it once a day. Or if things are really tough, you might say, if I really need a headline, I'll get it from a friend. you know you might only read headlines and not read articles. You might limit your time on social media, because sometimes social media has surprise bad news on the feed. It's like food, cat picture, horrible news. It's a lot. So there's different ways you can limit your intake of news. And if you need to cut it off altogether so that you can take care of yourself and regulate, that is also okay. It doesn't make you a bad person.
And I think like it's not always just about the bad news. I think sometimes that, and I haven't heard it talked about too much, but hearing good news about other people's lives, too much of it, or kind of a look at me, like it then, we have a tendency to kind of like play that comparison game too much, which probably doesn't help ourselves as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like I said, we little humans weren't really designed to receive this much information on a daily basis. So even if it's good news, it can be a lot. I recently just reset I have an app that lets me time my app usage. So I was like 5 minutes on Facebook, that's it, because otherwise I'll compulsively scroll, even though it's going to make me feel awful and tired and weird. So yeah, especially for neurodivergent people, sometimes you really do have to limit how much information is
Mm-hmm.
coming into your brain, because it takes us longer to process it.
Now I've just told people I don't watch the news, and when good things are happening in their life, I don't like it. So
Yep, that's it. That's
that
the PR move right there.
that's why we do autism stories, to share news from wonderful news from other autistic people and hear about all the wonderful things that all of us are doing in their lives. So, Lianne, I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining me here today.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. This was great.
Thanks so much to Lianne for the conversation. To learn more about Lianne, please check out the link in the podcast description for this episode. Here at Autism Personal Coach, our clients are the experts, our coaches are the guides. The majority of supports for autistics are not helpful. They try to fix us, not support us. That's why many are confused when we say our clients are the experts, experts of their lived experience. Our clients are the experts for what has worked for them and about the things that they need and want in their lives. Our coaches first listen to our clients, then ask thoughtful questions, offer resources, and strategize with our clients so they can get what they need to thrive. Would you want a guide in your life to coach you to get you the things you desire? If so, then visit autismpersonalcoach.com for more information. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Autism Stories. And if you did, if you could tell a friend, foe, or anyone you know about it so they could have the same enjoyable and educational experience as you when listening to Autism Stories, it would be very much appreciated. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.